So yes, welcome everybody. First of all, thanks for the organizers for organizing this meeting. I'm glad to be here to talk today about source maps in Angular. So in this talk, we first are going to have a look about source maps. So what are source maps and why do we even need them? Then we are going to take a deep dive into the inner workings of source maps. So how are they constructed and how do they work? And then we are going to have a specific look at how do source maps work in Angular, how are they integrated in Angular, especially in the Angular CLI. And we are also going to have a look at how can we handle them in production, because in my experience, this is often something that is unclear. So first, let me short introduce myself. My name is Kevin Kreuzer. You can see this beautiful picture here. This is actually a picture that I took during my last Christmas holiday when I was snowboarding. Reason for that is I live quite near this region, so I'm from the south of Switzerland. I live 1 hour away from the Matterhorn in a small city called Brick. And you can see you have a lot of sun there. One disadvantage is our dialect is quite strong, so most guys in Switzerland don't understand us, but we understand the rest. So I'm quite glad that this presentation is in English. I'm a freelance software engineer. I work at a company called Schaltstelle. That's kind of a special company because we are a bunch of freelancers who work together. Our slogan is like, together independent. So we still do stuff together, like we work on some interesting project ideas in our office in Bern, but in the end we are still independent and we help each other to find projects. So that's more or less what we do there. Currently I'm in a client project at Mobiliar. There I'm in a front-end architecture team, it's called. And we do a lot of stuff with Angular, AngularJS, ng-upgrade, and also some Node stuff. So we basically are responsible for supporting the feature teams and putting like infrastructure or provide infrastructure. Then, last but not least, I'm also a co-founder at a startup called Tracier, which is about traceability in distributed systems. So maybe some of you have heard of the terms open tracing, and what it does, it basically gives you technical information of your microservice calls, and we think that's not enough, so we focus on another level, like we also are interested in the data, so we also store the payloads, and with Tracier you get insight into your data, and we enable much easier bug tracking, for example. Like that's the main idea there. If you're curious about one of those topics like Schaltstelle or Tracier or stuff that we do at Mobiliar, just come talk to me after the presentation. So the talk I give today is based on a blog post that I wrote for Angular in Depth, which you can also check out. It's called Debug Angular Apps in Production Without Revealing Source Maps. So yeah, if you have time, go and check it out. So there will be, yeah, you can have another look over the topic from today. Then last week, I had the chance to be a guest on Adventures in Angular. Maybe some of you know this podcast. And I was invited there to talk about source maps. So I don't know exactly when it will be out, but I think next week or maybe 2 weeks. I will put the link to the presentation, so also make sure to check that out. Okay, let's dive into the topic. So to start with, let's first have a look at modern JS build, or basically modern Angular builds. So if we write Angular today, we write it in TypeScript, or yeah, we should write it in TypeScript. And this gives us a lot of advantages, like it gives us the optional typing system, and with this typing system we get better tooling, better refactoring, better IntelliSense, and it allows us to write less error-prone applications. And as you can see, TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript, so it also gives us access to features that haven't made it to the language yet. So this is also quite nice, but we always need to keep in mind that TypeScript is only used during compile and edit time. So we don't have TypeScript at runtime. It doesn't run in the browser. So normally we compile down to a JavaScript version. So as we all have to support, or sadly have to support IE, mainly we compile down to ES5 because that's supported by all browsers. And that's like the first thing that happens. So we compile down to a JavaScript version. There are a lot of other things that also happen. So for example, during development, we focus on writing like nicely structured code with modules and classes. And then when we go to production, our code gets bundled and we only have the bundles that we deliver. So these are some things that happen during our build process. And there are a bunch of other optimizations, like Angular is doing, the build optimizer is doing a lot of stuff. There are other optimizations that happens. So in the end, what we have, like we wrote our nice code there with here with some RX operators and nicely structured. But when we go to production, we end up with something like this. So we can also see here on the first line in this compiled code that we have like not variable names, but we have E, T, N, and so it's quite hard to find or to debug this code. So therefore we need some sort of mechanism to map this transpiled code back to its original sources. That's exactly where source maps come in. So source maps are just a mechanism that allow us to make this mapping. So source maps have been there for a long time. I think initially they were used with the Google Closure compiler, and now they are in version 3. So currently version 3 is still a proposal since 2011. If you look up the spec is just a Google Docs file with like 5 or 6 pages. It's not really huge, and there are a lot of properties that are unclear and a lot of open discussion about this spec. But basically anybody has adopted to it. So I went through the spec, and based on the spec, I want to explain to you the anatomy of a source map. So a source map has different properties, like the first property that always needs to be there is the version property. And this is currently version 3. Then it is followed, or there's a file property, which indicates to which file this source map belongs to. And actually this file property is optional in the spec. It was, for a long time it was required, and there were tools that throw error if it wasn't there, but now it's optional. Reason for that is because the debugger already fetches the source map, and because he knows from which file it fetches the source maps, he knows to which file it belongs. Then there's the source root. So this is just a path, and maybe we first have a look at the sources property. So if we bundle our code, like we would, let's say we would bundle out.js out of foo.js and part.js. Foo and part.js appear here as the sources. And if they would both have like a specific path, for example, they would lie under example, we would put this path under source root so that we don't have to rewrite it on every entry of the sources. And then there's an interesting property which is called sources content, and that's also an optional field. But actually what happens, or if you do a build with the Angular CLI, which uses Webpack under the hood, your whole TypeScript code will be inlined into this property. It's optional, but your whole code will be there. Like you can see really your TypeScript code. So there are two ways like how source maps can make the mapping back to the original sources. Either you host the sources, or as I said, you inline it here. And that's what's happening in the Angular CLI right now. Then there's this names property, which is kind of an interesting property because there are a lot of discussions if it's even interpreted by debuggers or not. So for me it's unclear if debuggers even read it, but the idea would be to display correct stack traces with the correct name. And then, last but not least, there's the mappings entry, which is where the whole magic happens. So this is the most important entry of the source maps. And as you can see, there are just a bunch of encoded value like A, and B, and it doesn't make much sense. And that's exactly where we're going to dive deep now. We're going to have a look what this mappings entries means. And to explain that, I thought of a way to explain it, and I ran around the blog post from David Nisimov, I think, and I really liked the way he explained it, and I think this is really useful and helped me to understand the source maps. So therefore, let's just take a step back, and this guy we probably all know is the little guy from Star Wars who always gives this good advice. But one thing that is also, when he talks, the words come out in a weird order. So imagine he would be a transpiler. Like the way, and we call him Yoda transpiler. The way he would work is like we would have the sentence feel the force, and we would pass it through the Yoda transpiler, and outcome would be the force field. Like that's basically what a transpiler does. And our task now is to create a source map for exactly that. So let's start with the most basic source map. So we could say the output location, which is line 1, column 0. So this would be like the T on the right side. I think from you it's the right side. And we could say this maps to the input file, which is on the left side, and to line 1, column 5. And so we could say like this letter maps to this letter, and so on. Like the same for the H, for the E, and so on. I think that's like the most basic way. If we would represent this and just write the values with a pipe separator, we would end up with 283 characters, which is quite huge, quite a huge source map just for such a small thing. We could already improve, as you can see, or as you can see also here, in the output location we always write line 1. And maybe you've once opened the source map in the debugger and you can see that it's just one line. So we don't need this line information because it's always one line, so the compiled code. And we could just skip this one, and then we are already down to 245 characters. But this is still huge. So another improvement that we could do is, like, we could use indexes. Instead of writing Yoda input txt, we could just use the number 0. And you can already kind of make the association like with the sources property that we had before. So this is just an array, and we only write the index there. And then a source map could look like line 1, column 0, input index instead of the file name, maps to line 1, column 5. And then also like the names, we don't map the whole, each letter, we just map the names. And this would already bring us down to 31 characters, which is kind of cool. But this is like a source map more or less works. And then there was, source maps were quite huge, really huge. And then they introduced VLQ, which stands for variable length quantity. And this bring down the size of a source map. So source maps were 10 times smaller with this algorithm. And this is just a really space-saving way of store this value. And to explain what it does, we basically could have a look like, imagine you want to represent a 4-digit number. We could represent it with this pipe separator. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. If you already know that it's a 4-digit number, you don't even need the pipe separator. But this kind of doesn't work if you have more than 1-digit numbers. If you have 2-digit numbers, you still need this pipe separator. So what VLQ does, instead of pipe separator, it just uses, or here I display this as an underscore. And what this underscore means, it's a continuation. So you say, like the first value is a 1, then there's the second value 2, which has an underscore, which has a continuation. And then this means like, look up the next value, which is 3, doesn't have an underscore. So the second value needs to be 23. Then we have 4 continues, 5 continues, 6 doesn't have an underscore, so the third value needs to be 430. 56. And then the last one is 7. And this is basically how the VLQ algorithm more or less works. If we want to represent it with bits, we don't have underscores. So one thing that, or this is basically what VLQ, how it represents in bits. So we have these segments out of 6 bits, and it uses or it reserves the bit number 5 as a continuation bit. So this is basically like the underscore, and the first as a sign bit to indicate if a value is positive or negative. So if we would represent the number 1, we would just write like 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. And if we would represent the negative 1, we would just set the last bit to 1. So we would have -1. If we want to represent the 15 with continuation, we just set the first bit to 1 to indicate that it continues. And with this knowledge, we can now try to represent some values. So the first value we're going to represent is 1, and that's quite easy. Here's always under the number you can see like the bit representation, and on the side the mapping to these segments. So we just fill in the 1, we say it's a positive value, so we set the side bit to 0, and then we fill up the rest with zeros. And it doesn't need a continuation. So it gets more interesting with the value 23. And the way it works is like it's a positive value. So on the first segment we set the bit, the sign bit to 0. And then we start from behind. So we say 1, 1, 1, 0 fits into the first group. We put that in. And then we say the first one, which is the red one here, doesn't fit in, so it needs a continuation. And this is what we express with bit 5 there at the beginning. And then we put the rest that didn't fit into the second segment there. As you can see, on the second segment, there is no sign bit again, because the value can either be positive or negative. No need to have like 2 sign bits. Same goes for 456. So 0, 0, 1, we put it to the first group, it's a positive value. And then on bit 5 we add a 1 because it needs a continuation. And then we put the rest of the values in the second group. And same for 7. So if we would then just write all these segments after each other, we would end up with something like that. And as you can see, those are 6-bit or always 6 bits. This is like a good fit for base 46 encoding. And if we encode those values, we would get something like this. And those are actually the values that you get or that you see in the mappings array. So this is basically how VLQ works and how it is done.
Where do you get your 10 times increase or reduction from? 10 times smaller this way?
Because before you had, actually I don't know exactly how it was written before, but before you had to store always the separators. Imagine you would store it in an array, then you always need to store the commas and so on. Like for 4 numbers, for huge numbers.
Yeah, okay, here you're storing 5 bits in 6. So that's a 1/6 reduction.
Mm-hmm. Before you had to store like all the separators.
Before you had to store maybe 16, that's max, right?
Yes, but imagine it gets really, really huge.
Okay, I might miss some details, so don't worry.
Yeah, but we can talk afterwards. But normally the source maps get really huge, so there will be a lot of character. Even if you store with 1 segment only 2 characters, this will be like a huge improvement. Okay, so a sample map would maybe look like this, and we are already have optimized it. If you're curious about VLQ and want to play around with it, so on NPM there's this cool module called VLQ.js, and you can just download it and decode and encode values with it. So basically, if you would decode this, you would then get an array of 8, 0, 4, 16. And what it means, like the 0 is the column in the output file, the 1 is the index in the sources array, so this is what we've seen before, the line in the input source file, and the column in the input source file. So here's an example, like we have the compile code, exports.add, and below we have the function, and we say like line 8 maps to the file at index 0, which is add.js, at line 4 and column 16. So it's basically how he maps the different stuff. Now that we know how source maps work, how are they retrieved? So there are two ways to retrieve source maps. One is maybe you have seen that in your bundle, like this comment at the end of the file. There you can see where the source maps lie, and they will be downloaded from there. Another option is when you fetch your main bundle, you could also send the source map header in response, and they would then be fetched from this location there. One thing that is important to note is like source maps are only downloaded when the DevTools are open, so they won't have any performance impact for your normal users as long as they don't open the DevTools. Okay, now we covered like source maps, so let's have a look how they work in Angular, especially in the Angular CLI. So first, we have source maps during development. We have the ngserve command that we all know and use. And there we have like different properties that we can set. For example, we have evil source map, which is deprecated right now. But this is one type of source map that comes from it uses Webpack under the hood, and Webpack itself has like 8 or 9 different types of source maps. And basically, better source maps result in slower builds, and faster or less detailed source maps result in lower builds and faster builds. And evil source map was just one of them, so it would just take your code, put in an evil statement, and pass the data URL as last argument. But this was quite fast for build time, but yeah, you don't really use it. Then we have the source maps property, which is default to true, and this is the property that actually generates you the source map, if this property is set to true. Then there's vendor source map. This was used to resolve vendor maps, which was mainly used for Source Map Explorer. That's a tool that does something similar to the Webpack bundle analyzer, just to analyze what's included in your bundle. But this is also like rarely used. So if we would this is a small application I made where you can just change the title, and there we put a breakpoint, so we can see that our sources are retrieved under this Webpack entry here, and then we have the app component there, and we set our breakpoint, so this is like nothing new. So locally we have source maps, and if we have error in production, we can always try to reproduce that locally to debug. And even if the bug is based on some HTTP request, we could still take the response out, and just in the place where we do our HTTP request, we could just return a stream with this response, or just, yeah. And if we do, or if we can reproduce locally, this has like some advantages. So we can easier debug the observable chains. So we can put in like some tab operators, also console log statements, put in direct debugger statements, or in our template, subscribe with the async pipe and JSON. So those are the advantages. We can also try to apply fixes. And also we have, when we do that locally, we also have ngprobe available, which we don't have after an AOT build. And that's kind of nice. But it's not always that easy. So this is an actual screenshot from our UI, from our startup. And this is basically a high-level overview how it works with us. So we have some clients, and they just send data to our collector, and we do stuff with them. and then we display them in the user interface. So you can see here like requests that were made, and then also the payload. And in our case, this data is only sent in production, and the whole UI is basically rendered on the data. And this is often not easy to reproduce because the data is based on multiple requests and based on a role that is added to a token, and it's not easy to reproduce, or you have to take a lot of effort to reproduce a bug locally on your dev system. And therefore, we thought like, how does it even go when we go to production, or how can we reproduce such bugs or debug such bugs? So first, let's have a look how it behaves in production. So if you do an ng build, we will have source maps by default. But if we do an ng build prot build, so -- prot, we don't have source maps available there. So it will be set to false. If you then open up, or if you do a prot build from the same application that I showed before, and you would open up the dev tools, you would just see your main bundle, so no webpack entry, not at all, and you would go, or you would need to somewhere search for something that you remember from your code, like the string. Source maps are awesome. Chrome helps us with prettify the code, but as it gets bigger, it's DevTools have come to their limit, I think, or sometimes. And we then set the breakpoint on line 7841 somewhere, and we can also see that it's not really our code, so we don't have classes there. It gets compiled down to prototypes, and this is not so nice to debug. We thought then, like, how can we have source maps in production in Angular? So one thing you can do is, like, you can just ng build -- prot -- source map, and then source maps will be generated, like you know it from the dev build. Another thing that you can do is you can use in your Angular JSON, there's this architect property, and here you can see their source map. Actually, you need to set it to true to enable them, not to false. And then source maps would also be generated. But then this would behave in the exact same way that the dev build behaves. So we would deploy our application, and now everybody that open up the dev tools can just see our whole structure and our code and the source maps. And this is like a question, should we reveal our sources? I think if you work in an open source project, then for sure do it. I mean, anybody can anyway see your sources, but most of us don't work in open source projects, and so maybe it's more critical to expose your whole, or to reveal your whole source code. And therefore, in our startup, we also didn't want to expose our whole source code, and we thought, like, how can we have source maps without exposing the source code? We then did what all the developers do. We went on, did a Google search, and there we found like 3 proposals on how you could handle them. One is you could deliver source maps over a VPN so that only people inside your company can reach source maps. One thing that was also suggested was like that you could use server-side toggling and just use the source map header and set it or not based on some conditions. Or there are some debug tools like Sentry, which is an open source tool. I think it's less a debug tool, it's more like an error reporting tool. And there you could some way upload your source maps, and then it would fetch it and display the error in the correct way. But the sources that proposed these approaches were all like not Angular specific sources, those were just general sources. And if you do that in Angular, you will have like some problems, or at least with the Angular CLI. So with the first approach, you would need to change this comment at the end. So where does it fetch the source maps? You would need to change that to a VPN somewhere. And you cannot really do that with the Angular CLI, so there's no way currently to adjust this string at the end. Webpack itself has a plugin for that, but the Angular CLI doesn't allow that. Then with servers, so uploading source maps and also debug tools like Sentry, you would have to first, when you generate your build, you will generate with source maps, and then you would take those source maps and upload them somewhere. And this will then lead in a 404 on your web server, which is not too bad, but it can happen. Yeah, the way, or why not just generating without source maps and then just generate them and take the source maps there and upload it somewhere? So the reason is there is this string at the end of the source maps. So as soon as you generate with -- source map, this string will be generated. And as soon as the content of the file is the same, Webpack will generate a unique hash. But if you once generate your source map without your build without source maps, and once with source maps, the hash will be different. And also the hash or the file property in the source maps will not match. So technically you would generate like wrong source maps. This was also discussed on various GitHub issues, and now since Angular 7.2 beta, I think, there's a new way of doing this, and this isn't documented yet, or at least I haven't found it. I just found it by looking at the pull request that was merged there. And now you have in your Angular CLI, so there's this architecture property, and there you have now source maps entry. Like we've seen before, this that was set to false. And it gives you like a more fine control over how you can handle source map. So there's now new this hidden property, which you can set to true, and this will generate hidden source maps. And we will see in a second what hidden source maps are. Then there's the scripts property, which says if you want to have source maps only for scripts or not. So you could also generate source maps only for styles with these properties. And then there's also the vendor property that was deprecated before. Then one thing to notice is you cannot just set hidden to true and just leave scripts and styles away. This will not work. So once you set hidden to true, you also need to explicitly set script and styles. That's one thing that that you should keep in mind. So hidden source maps, this is kind of a fancy name, but in the end what it really is like it just generates the source maps locally, but it doesn't put the string at the end of your file. That's basically what it does. So you could then generate like correct source maps, take those source maps and upload them to Sentry, for example, to an error reporting tool without getting any problems. So this is the idea of this pull request. So let's go again back to, this is the same slide that I had before. Like we in our startup were thinking, okay, cool, we now have this knowledge, we know how source maps work, we now know these different concepts, so let's do it. But then we realized pretty soon that we don't have a VPN. So, okay, the first one off the table. Then the second one, we don't want to have like server-side specific logic just for source maps, and because once we toggle it in, it would be available to everybody for this amount of time, and we didn't want to make like some checks. So we only serve our application over an Nginx, and that's quite enough for us. So this approach was also not really valuable to us. And the last one, like Sentry, we don't use Sentry, so also off the table, and we were back to 0. And what we thought of, we thought of some alternative approaches. Are there any ways to have source maps in production without revealing them? And what we did, we went on and searched again on Google, and we found this tip here, this DevTool tip. I don't know if it's... yeah. Actually, I don't know how to play it because we switched, we had to upload the presentation here on Keynote and I switched the computer. But basically what he does is in Chrome there's an option where you can just open your bundle, right click and then upload the source maps. And we thought like, yeah, that's pretty cool and how can we use that in Angular? And so this is now the part where I need to switch here the laptop. There's some issue because you will see that it flickers.
So like the macOS tries to prevent piracy, so when we try to stream it put like some flicker like every 5 seconds because it's blue screen flash. So it's unfortunate.
Yes, so we came up with two approaches. One was, yeah, you can see the flickering there.
So you also show the video, right? Now we have the video.
Ah, yes. This should now work. Yes, exactly. What he did there is like he right-clicked, add source maps, and he just added the source maps, and they got uploaded. And we thought like, how can we use that? And we came up with two different approaches. One approach was that we just upload the source maps as soon as we need them. So I want to show you that, what I've done here. Yeah, hope you can see it. This is just a normal Angular CLI project, just a normal setup. And we have just added here this build prod task, which does ngbuild ---- prod. And then we have inside our Angular JSON, we just used the new feature that I presented before. Like we say under configurations production, we say source map, we want to have hidden source map with scripts and styles. And then we added like another script which is called build local. And the idea was just to indicate that we have a prod build where we just generate our code, host it, and then at a later point we come and build locally our source maps. It's just we build it to another path just to illustrate how it could behave. So we just open up a terminal. Yeah, and also notice the cow that tells you a Chuck Norris joke. So yes, so we would just run a prod build. Like that. More. That's it, okay. So we just do a prod build, which builds our application, which is normally a very good idea to do that during presentations, but it should be not take too much time.
92% when you get started.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we can see that we generated inside our this directory. Still need to get used to this table. Put it up here. So we can see that we now have our main bundle. And now, the interesting thing is like if we just pull out here, just ignore the rocket, you can see that there's no comment at the end. So that's like the important thing. So if we would just host this, and I'm going to use HTTP server, it's a node module that I like for doing this stuff. So if we just host this, we can see this nice application here. And if we would just open up the dev tools, we can see that there are no source maps at all. So we have our main bundle without the comment, but now we don't have any source maps. So let's now say like time passes and we come at a later point. Again here, and now, can't remember the command. It was like build local. So this would basically just build the source maps at a later point. Yeah, again. So now, if we go here under local maps, we can see again that we there generated the source maps. And now one thing that is important, like we have this BCE, this is basically the bundle name. And if we would now inspect here the file property, we can see that this bundle name exactly matches the name. So we have really correct source maps. And now what we can do is like, maybe there are better ways to copy the path, but I kind of like that because I don't have to type the whole thing. Maybe copy. So I copied this path there. Now if I go here and paste this path, I can see that that's basically the location of my local source maps. And you can see that it added this file at the beginning. And now we can copy this path, go here, say add source maps, and paste the path in. Now we can already see that the Webpack thing appeared. Then with Command P, we can just search for our app component, put a breakpoint there, change the title, and now we have the source maps available. And that's something we can do without, or we can generate them at a later point. So this was our first approach. And there we can see what we've done. Not too fancy tools, we just add source maps. We set the property hidden to true, scripts to true, styles to true. Then we do a prod build. We would find the matching commit and just like upload the source maps. Then this is for Angular 7.2. Before Angular 7, you could also do something similar, like you build your application with the source maps. In a post-build script, you just remove them, and then at a later point, you build them and upload them. And this was a cool approach for us. It worked, but it still took some effort, like we needed to find the matching commit, regenerate them locally, and so on. And we thought like it would be cool if we just have source maps, but just hide them. And what we mean by that is, let me just go here. Maybe let's close this one. And let me just clean up that. So now I switch to a branch where I want to illustrate this feature, or what we use currently is you still have this Angular JSON with these different properties like hidden, scripts, and styles, the same as before. And we also have a prod build. And what we do now is inside our directory, we create another directory, which is called Conan. This comes from, there's an anime with an Asian detective Conan it's called, therefore we call it Conan. And then we just move the source maps to this folder, basically. So if anybody knows how to do this command like nicer, I would be curious or glad to know, because I haven't found a module that creates a folder and moves stuff there. So if we again run build prod, Then this will generate us the dist folder with source maps demo and also Conan folder, and it will move all the source maps into this folder. Now we can see that we have here the main files and we have the Conan folder. And if we change into the Conan folder, we can see that our maps or our source maps are now there. So if we would now serve up our application again, like here, we can close the old one. We again have, or this would now be our production build, and if somebody opens it, we wouldn't have any source maps there. But we as developers now know that if we open this in a new tab, we know that under Conan, and then, yeah, it's already there, like that there lies our source map. So it's on the web server, but it's not retrieved. We just hide them. And now what we can do is go again to our main bundle, add the source map, just use this URL, add it. We again have the webpack property with the sources. We can put, it's still recognizing it. We can put the breakpoint there, and so we can just toggle in and out source maps. And this is an approach that we currently use at our startup, and we have like good experience with this. So those are like approaches that are not really, or we just came up with these approaches because we dived deeper into the source map, and just those are approaches that we just came up with. So again, what you need to do is like just source maps, set it to hidden, scripts, and styles, and then in a post build you just move them into the folder that you create. Then you could also hide the source maps in previous versions from Angular. It looks quite the same. Yeah, you just build it with the -- source map flag and then just move them. That's the difference. But anyway, you would still have like this 404 error because it generates the comment at the end of the file. One thing, as soon as, or when you come to lazy loading, then it's quite helpful if you use one of those approaches to name your chunks. So build with named chunks, because then you get like a name, like search module, and not just some random hash. Because then if you have like preload module strategies, then it's quite hard to guess which file belongs to which source map. So conclusion, yeah, source maps are awesome. They help us really, they help us to debug. There are not a lot of resources and specs, or there are not a lot of resources out there about this topic. Like, I think for most developers it just works, and nobody wants to dive deeper. It just works, or it kind of works. Then also a lot of people don't, or what I've seen in some companies, they just don't think about how you can have them in production. Then another thing that I noticed is that the specs are not too detailed. Like, there are a lot of open things about source maps, a lot of open properties with a lot of open discussions. And then, yeah, as I showed you, like, you can have different approaches for having them in production without revealing them, which is kind of nice. Yes, so last but not least, so if you want to contact me, or it would be nice to get in touch, you can find me on Medium, on GitHub, Twitter, or just write me an email. Like, thanks a lot for your attention. Are there questions or?
So yeah, your last approach, you're kind of hiding them, but you're still serving it up, so someone knows. Essentially, it's serving through obscurity. If I find your Conan thing,
yes,
I see everything.
Yeah, then you see everything. But anyway, with source maps, technically, even though we are delivering compiled or transpiled JavaScript, we are also delivering resources. Like it's if anybody knows it, he could edit, yes. But then he needs to know the exact string and
Have you thought about just adding some simple authentication to that host? To be performed as needed by developers?
Maybe you could. I don't know.
I mean, secure the whole host and anyone who doesn't have access to that.
Yeah, that goes more into the direction, like for example, like hosting it over a VPN. That would be also something that you could do. But I don't know how it.
But I meant something like simple HTTP authentication.
Yeah, you could also do something.
Very simple to set up and VPN.
I'm not sure.
You can use Nginx and limit the path or the given folder with the source maps to only certain IP addresses.
Okay.
They don't need to be nothing, just need a fixed IP address, which you can with any server that you spin anywhere. So
Yeah, that would. Then that would be a nice approach.
I mean, the comment in the JavaScript file, the thing that the browser uses, that can be a full URL.
Yeah, that can be a full URL, but actually that's what I meant before. I don't know how you can, with the Angular CLI, how you can adjust this URL. That's like, Webpack itself has plugins to do so, but it's currently... that would be...
Magic script.
Yeah, that's also what I thought, but that would probably work.
What about, is there a way like, okay, so if sometimes you build an application and you have like just one bundle file, but like if you have more or if you have like a lazy module or something, then you really have to add it like one by one.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That's like one of the downsides.
So it kind of punishes you for doing it right. So if you have like lazy roots, then it's like, oh, too bad.
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly you're debugging in one module. Yeah, it depends.
Depends.
If you have like some core services or services that are shared, then you would have to do it twice. That's a downside, yeah.
Do you think maybe to have a Chrome plugin so you could basically automatically add these files to each other, or?
Haven't thought about it, but it would be nice if you could do that. Yeah.
Have a Chrome plugin and then you could probably automatically put some local file or in the server. I don't know, just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how you can access or tell the debugger that he really adds it to this file. I don't know exactly how it looks like, but it would be nice if you have like a way to do so. That would be nice.
Are those comments the only way to tell the browser where those source maps are?
Yeah, you can also use the header in the response where your files will be fetched. So once you will go and fetch your main.js, in this response you can also set a source map header, and there could be the location. Then it would fetch it from there. So those are two ways.
And then you can like set any URL you want. So
Yeah. It's also what we done there, like add local source map. We set just URL or just even file works if you host it locally.
Or you could combine it twice, once with source maps and once without, and then you deploy both versions in different directories, and based on what IP you are coming from, your Nginx serves one thing or another. So if you come from your office, you will get the source map without any additional magic. You will just be deploying the source map, and then Nginx does the filtering of who sees what.
That would work, but you assume that your build always like is really deterministic. Like you would build the same app twice.
Yes.
And if somebody, normally this is the case, but there are also cases where the build is not always like super deterministic. Like it's not the same bundle then. It's a valuable approach, but it would technically there are two different apps then.
They would have different hash because of the comment.
Yes.
But
But it would also be like two separate builds.
Yes, you build it once, you upload it, build it at a certain time without changing anything apart from the switch or configuration.
Yeah, that would work.
And go further.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, there's also this discussion with the continuous integration. If you build an app on each stage, or if you build it once and then just move it from one stage to another. Technically, it should always be the same artifact that you move. And because during your build something can go wrong, and here it would also be like you would technically deploy like two different apps and one, something.
So you were saying before that you didn't want to modify the web server configuration, right? So
Yes.
it will imply you will need to modify the.
But you would, not what is running already, but when you just start today and you keep doing it, then whenever you discover the bug, you know that you already have the source map.
Yeah.
What if these 2 minutes while you build the application, like there's like some release of some npm package which introduces like a break exchange, unfortunately the fixed version, and in your build you also do npm install.
That's why you fix your NPM version.
Yeah, sure, but does everybody perfectly does that all the time? That's the question. You should, but it doesn't work perfectly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Like you assume that builds are then deterministic.
I have another idea. What about the service worker that intercepts the request for the debug maps?
I think that could also work.
Yeah, and then in the service worker, you can do fetch redirects, right? You can do an authenticated fetch to a web server and just get the source maps and route it back with the original request. I think that would be quite cool. And then you can have this service worker as an add-on that you can inject into your runtime, and as soon as it's there, it will get the debug maps from anywhere using service worker HTTP request into the section.
Yeah, I think that should work. Yes.
I don't know if these requests are any special. From
No, I think this is just normal. Yeah, like you load your main bundle, just normal request. Yeah, and this was also like kind of hope that with the presentation that I gave, like that I have some deeper understanding or of some approach, and that people come up with their own approaches how to handle this stuff, and it's quite nice. It's already like a good suggestion.
Is there a bigger issue or a request for actually being able to change the comment URL?
I think, I'm not sure, I looked it up last week, but I'm not sure if there is. I think I forgot. So there was for sure discussions about the hidden source maps, but I'm not sure if there's already an open issue for that.
Have you considered making a pull request?
Yeah, considered, but we once I once made a pull request to the Angular CLI, but it was not like, it was a painful experience.
Okay.
So, like I had to fix a lot of stuff that I didn't, a lot of tests that were failing, but not because of my changes and so. But yeah, maybe I will consider it.
Cool. That's it. So again, thank you very much, Kevin, for your
Thanks.
presentation.
Mhm.